You think a proposal is the most romantic moment of your life? Think again. Sometimes, a diamond ring is just the perfect bait for a trap set by the man sleeping beside you. My boyfriend and his wealthy family did not want my freedom. They wanted my software algorithm worth tens of millions of dollars. When deceit is disguised as family tradition, the most ruthless revenge is to smile and play along until the end. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Zoe Revenge Stories. Our channel was recently demonetized by YouTube, leaving us with no budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Your support will help pay our hardworking team so they can cover their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. Now, let me tell you about my nightmare. My name is Alice Schmidt. I am 28 years old, and until recently, I thought I had my entire life perfectly mapped out. I worked as a lead 3D graphic designer and video editor at Vortex Renderings in Chicago. I had just poured my soul into completing a revolutionary spatial simulation software algorithm, something I knew was going to change the industry forever. And then, there was Julian. Julian Vance was a suave financial investment director, born into a powerful, old money, and fiercely conservative family on the East Coast. For 3 years, our relationship felt like an absolute dream. He was charming, attentive, and seemingly perfect in every single way. To celebrate our 3rd anniversary, Julian took me to the most exclusive, candlelit restaurant in the city. The ambiance was flawless. I saw him reach into his tailored jacket pocket, my heart racing as I anticipated the romantic proposal I had been dreaming of. But instead of pulling out a velvet box, he pulled out a leather-bound itinerary. He leaned across the table, his eyes locking onto mine, and delivered a bizarre ultimatum. He told me that the Vance family had a sacred tradition. Before he could ever put a ring on my finger, I had to fly to their private winter estate, formally kneel on the floor, and beg his father, Richard Vance, for permission to marry his son. I sat there in pure shock. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline of a terrible joke. But his face remained completely deadpan. I refused flat out. "Julian, you cannot be serious," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of confusion and anger. "I am a modern, financially independent American woman. The very idea that I had to fly across the country and get on my knees to ask another man for permission to marry a fully grown adult was utterly ridiculous. It was degrading and stripped away every ounce of my dignity." That was when the flawless facade of Julian Vance shattered into a million sharp pieces. The gentle, polite man I had loved for 3 years vanished in the blink of an eye. His face turned a deep, furious shade of red. He slammed his fist onto the table, deliberately knocking over his crystal wine glass, sending dark red wine splashing across the crisp white tablecloth like blood. "You are unbelievably selfish," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. He accused me of disrespecting his heritage and his family name. Then, the real threat came. He leaned in closer, his tone dropping to a chilling whisper, warning me that my career at Vortex Renderings would hit a permanent dead end if I did not have the backing of the Vance family empire. Before I could even process the sheer malice in his words, he threw a stack of $100 bills onto the ruined table, turned on his heel, and stormed out of the restaurant. I was left sitting there alone, completely paralyzed by the sudden violence of his outburst. As the waiters nervously rushed over to clean up the broken glass, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I realized, with absolute terror, that I had just witnessed a cruel, fiercely controlling side of the man I loved, a dark reality that had been hiding beneath his expensive suits and charming smiles for 3 entire years. For 3 excruciating weeks, my phone remained completely silent. Julian ghosted me. He did not call, he did not text, he simply vanished from my daily life, leaving an agonizing void where his morning greetings and evening check-ins used to be. It was the classic silent treatment, a textbook psychological abuse tactic designed to suffocate me in my own anxious thoughts. I spent countless hours pacing the wooden floors of my apartment, staring blankly at the ceiling, constantly questioning my own sanity. Was I being too stubborn? Did I overreact to a simple request? The isolation felt like a heavy, leaden blanket, making it physically hard to breathe. Every single time my phone vibrated with a random email or news notification, my heart jumped into my throat, only to plummet into my stomach when I saw it was not his name on the screen. He was punishing me. He was starving me of his affection, waiting until I was desperate enough to crawl back on my hands and knees. Then, the messages from our mutual friends started pouring in. First it was Sarah, then Mark, then Chloe. It happened almost simultaneously over the span of 48 hours, as if they had all been given a theatrical cue. "You really should just yield a little," Sarah texted me on a Tuesday morning. "It is just a formality. Do not throw away 3 years of a beautiful relationship over foolish pride." Later that afternoon, Mark called me, casually dropping the exact same phrases into our conversation. "Richard is an eccentric billionaire. Just humor him. It means the world to Julian." I listened to them, a sickening realization slowly washing over me. Their words were far too precise, too perfectly aligned. It sounded exactly like they had memorized a public relations script handed to them by Julian himself. They were not reaching out to check on my well-being. They were acting as his loyal proxies, actively tightening the psychological screws around my mind. The gaslighting did not stop at my personal life. It quickly seeped into the sterile walls of Vortex Renderings, my three-dimensional software project. The one I had just finalized and was preparing to push into beta testing suddenly hit a massive, inexplicable brick wall without any prior warning. The executive board of directors summoned me for a tense, 20-minute emergency meeting. They stared at me with cold, detached expressions and announced that my department's research and development budget was being slashed by 60%. I demanded a logical explanation. I brought up our projected revenue streams, the hundreds of hours my development team had logged, and the undeniable market demand for our spatial simulation technology, but the board members simply deflected my questions, muttering vague, rehearsed excuses about corporate restructuring and shifting financial priorities. My life's work was being actively sabotaged right in front of my eyes. And I knew deep down in my bones it was not a mere coincidence. The real turning point, the moment the terrifying veil was completely ripped away, happened entirely by accident. My smartphone had been draining its battery unusually fast for 4 consecutive days. Being a professional who works intimately with code and software optimization, I decided to run a deep diagnostic scan to find the background drain. I fully expected to find a glitchy social media update or a poorly optimized weather application. Instead, hidden deep within the root system files, disguised under a generic utility naming convention, I found a customized tracker application. My blood ran completely cold. I pulled up the source code logs. It was actively pinging my exact global positioning system coordinates, recording my call durations, and logging my daily schedule. It was then silently uploading all of that highly sensitive data to an encrypted private server every single night at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. Someone was watching my every single move. Julian expected me to break. He fully expected the deafening silence, the intense peer pressure, and the sudden professional crisis to crush my spirit until I tearfully begged for his forgiveness. But he severely underestimated the woman he had been sleeping next to. I am not a fragile porcelain doll waiting to be saved or controlled. I am a structural engineer of virtual worlds, a woman who builds complex digital architectures from absolute scratch. Instead of succumbing to a puddle of despair, a white-hot fury ignited deep in my chest. The miserable tears dried up instantly, replaced by a razor-sharp, analytical clarity. My data-driven instincts screamed at me that this was no longer about a bruised male ego or an archaic family tradition. You do not bug a woman's personal phone and orchestrate a multi-million-dollar corporate blockade just because she refused to curtsy to your arrogant father. There was a much larger, infinitely darker equation at play here. I stopped waiting for his manipulating calls. I locked my apartment door, brewed a large pot of strong black coffee, and flipped open my laptop. I started digging. I used every digital footprint I could find to trace the internet protocol address of the private server the hidden tracker was communicating with. It was heavily masked behind firewalls, but it eventually routed back to a dummy shell corporation registered in Delaware. From there, I cross-referenced the specific board members at Vortex Renderings who had voted to cut my project funding with the vast investment portfolios managed by the Vance family empire. The financial connections were deliberately obscured through layers of proxy firms, but the paper trail was undeniably there. I even looked into the sudden career advancements of Mark and Sarah, utilizing a few gray area data, scraping techniques I had perfected over the years. The horrifying truth began to render itself on my screen like a malicious, fully textured three-dimensional model. This was a coordinated, highly funded corporate and psychological siege. I was not a defiant girlfriend. I was a high-value target. I knew Julian had a strict schedule. He was attending an exclusive, 3-day financial summit in New York, leaving his lavish downtown penthouse completely empty. I still had the spare key he had given me over 2 years ago. I let myself in, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind me. The apartment smelled faintly of his expensive cedar cologne, a scent that used to make me feel safe, but now made my stomach churn with disgust. I walked straight into his pristine home office and sat down at his custom-built desktop computer. Julian was a finance guy, not a tech expert. He thought dragging files to the recycling bin and clicking empty meant the data was gone forever. He was dead wrong. I pulled a small encrypted USB flash drive from my pocket, plugged it into the back of the tower, and booted the system from my own custom operating system. I bypassed his administrative passwords in less than 2 minutes and launched a deep sector recovery program. As the progress bar slowly crawled across the screen, my hands were shaking. I braced myself to find what any woman in my position would expect. I fully expected to uncover a secret folder full of hotel receipts, text messages with another woman, or photographs of a hidden affair. When the recovery software finally finished its deep dive, it spit out dozens of restored folders. I did not find another woman. What I found was infinitely more terrifying. It was a meticulously organized directory filled with draft legal documents, all deceptively labeled under the harmless title of the Vance Family Membership Registry. I clicked open the most recent portable document format file. At first glance, it looked like a standard, albeit extremely dense, prenuptial agreement mixed with an archaic induction ceremony script. But as my eyes scanned past the standard clauses about physical properties and stock portfolios, a specific section regarding intellectual property made my blood freeze in my veins. The document explicitly stated that upon receiving Richard Vance's formal blessing, the incoming family member was legally required to sign this registry to officially join the bloodline. But buried deep within the suffocating legal jargon was a trap designed specifically for me. The clause dictated that any and all intellectual property, digital assets, pending patents, and proprietary algorithms created by the incoming member would instantly be irrevocably transferred to the Vance Heritage Trust. They were not asking me to surrender my pride. They were asking me to sign away my life's work, my revolutionary three-dimensional spatial simulation algorithm, a software architecture valued by industry experts at tens of millions of dollars, would automatically become the exclusive property of their corporate empire the second my pen touched that paper. The entire kneeling tradition was nothing but an elaborate psychological smokescreen to secure a legally binding, multi-million-dollar asset transfer without paying me a single dime. My vision blurred with tears of pure rage, but I forced myself to keep digging. I opened an archived file containing his private email correspondence. I searched for messages sent to his father, Richard. The subject lines were clinical, treating me like a quarterly earnings report. I opened one email dated exactly 2 days after our disastrous anniversary dinner. Julian had written, "The gullible fool is exactly where we want her. She threw a tantrum, just as predicted. The isolation phase has commenced." I scrolled down, my chest tight, and read the next paragraph. I have confirmed with our board contacts that Vortex Renderings has officially slashed her departmental funding by 60%. The internal pressure is mounting. We are successfully starving the company out. Once her project is on the verge of total collapse, we will initiate the hostile takeover for pennies on the dollar, and she will have absolutely no choice but to come running to me for financial salvation. The brutal, suffocating truth crashed down on me like a concrete wall. Julian had never loved me, not for a single second of those 3 years. The romantic vacations to Europe, the gentle forehead kisses every morning, the way he held my hand during scary movies. It was all a masterfully executed performance. I was never his partner. I was merely a fat, clueless sheep carrying a technological goldmine on my back. And he was the butcher patiently leading me to the slaughterhouse. The Vance family did not want a daughter-in-law. They wanted a hostile corporate acquisition, perfectly wrapped in white silk and a diamond ring. They had orchestrated my professional downfall, isolated me from my friends, and monitored my movements, all to break my spirit so I would blindly sign away my masterpiece. I sat back in his leather chair, staring at the glowing monitor. A heavy, agonizing pain ripped through my chest, mourning the man I thought I knew and the future I thought we were going to build. But that profound grief only lasted for a few minutes. I took a deep, shuddering breath and wiped the tears from my cheeks. The sadness rapidly evaporated, leaving behind a core of solid, cold-blooded steel. I am an engineer. When I find a critical error in a system, I do not cry over it. I isolate the bug, and I rewrite the code. I carefully ejected my flash drive, leaving his computer exactly as I had found it, removing every trace of my intrusion. I decided right then and there that I would not confront Julian, I would not scream, and I would not demand answers. Instead, I was going to smile, look him directly in the eyes, and deliver the greatest acting performance of my entire life. They wanted to play a game of manipulation and corporate theft. I was going to show them exactly what happens when you try to steal from the woman who built the board. 2 days after I broke into his computer, I stood outside Julian's massive penthouse door, mentally preparing myself for the performance of a lifetime. I forced myself to think about the devastating loss of my project at Vortex Renderings, the sheer betrayal of the last 3 years, and the disgusting reality of his manipulation, until genuine tears welled up in my eyes. Then, I knocked. When Julian opened the door, looking down at me with a cold, calculated stare, I let the tears fall freely. I threw my arms around his neck, burying my face into his expensive tailored shirt. "Julian, I was so incredibly wrong," I sobbed, making sure my voice trembled with exactly the right amount of pathetic desperation. "I cannot live without you. The last few weeks have been absolute torture. I am so sorry for being so stubborn and arrogant. I will do whatever it takes. I will do anything your father asks of me. Please just take me back." I pulled away just enough to look at his face. The transformation was nauseating. The coldness completely vanished, replaced by a sickeningly triumphant smirk. His eyes gleamed, not with the warm glow of a man reunited with his true love, but with the raw, predatory greed of a vulture that had just cornered its wounded prey. He gently stroked my hair, his touch sending violent shivers of disgust down my spine, though I forced myself to lean into his hand. "I knew you would finally come to your senses, my sweet girl," he whispered, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. "Family tradition is everything. You just needed a little time to understand your place." Right then and there, he pulled out his smartphone and made a brief call. Within 5 minutes, he cheerfully announced that a lavish private dinner had been arranged at the Vance family winter estate in Aspen, Colorado, for that exact upcoming weekend. For the next 4 days, I lived a grotesque double life. During the daylight hours, I played the role of the broken, submissive girlfriend to absolute perfection. I allowed Julian to drag me through the most exclusive high-end boutiques in the city, nodding eagerly as he picked out a ridiculously conservative floor-length evening gown that made me look like a compliant 19th-century aristocrat. I stood in front of a full-length mirror for hours, practicing my posture, keeping my eyes respectfully lowered, and perfecting a delicate, obedient curtsy. I swallowed every ounce of my pride, feeding his monstrous ego at every possible turn. I let him lecture me on how a proper wife should behave in high society, absorbing his toxic words with wide, seemingly innocent eyes. But the moment the sun went down, and I was safely locked alone in my apartment, the submissive mask shattered. I moved through the digital shadows with lethal precision. I quietly liquidated a significant portion of my personal savings to retain the services of the most ruthless intellectual property lawyer in the entire United States. We worked frantically through the midnight hours, communicating only through heavily encrypted channels. First, we expedited the official registration of my spatial simulation algorithm, ensuring the copyright and sole ownership were undeniably locked to my name. Then, we executed the true masterstroke. We drew up a watertight legal contract and quietly sold an exclusive, irrevocable licensing agreement to the single largest competitor of the Vance corporate empire. They were a massive global technology conglomerate that had been actively trying to crush Richard Vance for over a decade. And they were more than happy to acquire the very technology Richard was secretly plotting to steal. The final piece of my preparation was much more intimate and required a very steady hand. For our first anniversary, Julian had gifted me a stunning vintage pearl brooch. It was a beautiful, elegant piece of jewelry and completely unsuspecting. Using my background in hardware modification and audio engineering, I spent an entire Tuesday night carefully prying open the intricate silver casing. I soldered a state-of-the-art, military-grade micro-recording device directly beneath the largest pearl. I wrote a custom script that linked the hidden transmitter directly to a secure remote cloud server, intentionally bypassing any localized signal jammers the Vance family might have installed at their fortified estate. Once activated, every single whisper, every boastful threat, and every word of their corporate extortion in Aspen would be captured in crystal-clear, high-definition audio. When Friday morning finally arrived, we boarded the Vance family private jet. The cabin was decorated in dark leather and polished walnut, reeking of old money and unearned privilege. The pressurized air inside the cabin felt thick and suffocating, making it difficult to draw a full breath. Julian sat across from me, sipping a glass of expensive champagne, looking completely relaxed and victorious. He honestly believed he had broken me. He believed I was flying into the frozen mountains to surrender my dignity and my life's work for the sake of his twisted love. I looked out the small oval window at the sprawling landscape passing thousands of feet below us. I turned back to Julian and offered him a soft, entirely innocent smile. Beneath that sweet facade, my mind was racing, coldly reviewing every single line of code, every legal clause, and every step of my revenge plan. I was not a lamb being led to the slaughter. I was the executioner. And I was bringing the guillotine right to their front door. The Aspen estate was an impenetrable fortress of stone and glass, perched high on a desolate, frozen mountain peak. A violent blizzard was tearing through the valley outside, howling against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows like a chorus of angry ghosts. The storm had completely cut off the private access roads, isolating us from the rest of civilization. Inside, however, the atmosphere was suffocatingly warm and dripping with extreme opulence. A massive stone fireplace roared at the edge of the formal dining room, casting long, flickering shadows across the grand mahogany table. Sitting at the very head of that table was Richard Vance. He was an imposing, terrifying figure with cold, slate-gray eyes and a custom-tailored suit that likely cost more than my entire college education. He did not bother to stand or greet me when I walked into the room. Instead, he slowly looked me up and down, his gaze lingering with a sharp, calculating intensity, exactly like a ruthless auctioneer silently pricing a piece of livestock on the block. Dinner was an absolute masterclass in psychological warfare. Course after course of exotic delicacies were served by silent, white-gloved staff, yet the rich food tasted like dry ash in my mouth. The Vance family used the elegant, candlelit meal as a deliberate opportunity to systematically dismantle my self-esteem. Richard swirled his vintage red wine and let out a dry, condescending chuckle. He looked across the table and asked me how my little three-dimensional drawing hobby was going, completely dismissing my years of complex software engineering as if I were a toddler playing with cheap crayons. He casually remarked that it was quite fortunate Julian had found me, since a girl from my modest, middle-class background would inevitably struggle to survive in the ruthless corporate world without a wealthy benefactor. Julian sat beside me, nodding in quiet agreement, gently patting my hand as if he were comforting a slow-witted child. I forced myself to swallow the burning bile rising in my throat. I kept my eyes respectfully lowered, offering meek, grateful smiles, flawlessly playing the perfectly broken, submissive prize they so desperately wanted me to be. When the agonizing 2-hour dinner finally concluded, Julian gently guided me by the elbow down a long, dimly lit corridor, leading me directly into Richard's private study. The room smelled heavily of aged scotch, expensive leather, and pure arrogance. The heavy oak doors clicked completely shut behind us, sealing us inside the soundproof room. Julian walked over to a massive antique desk and opened a black velvet box. Inside rested a diamond ring so absurdly large and gaudy, it looked almost comical, like a shiny heavy chain meant to lock me down. But my eyes immediately shifted to what was sitting right next to it. It was a thick, meticulously bound legal document. The cover page read, "Family Induction Certificate" in bold, imposing letters. Richard stepped out from the shadows near the towering bookshelves, holding a crystal glass of amber liquid. He did not bother with any warm, welcoming speeches or fake affection. He slammed a heavy gold pen onto the polished wooden desk. "Sign the paper, Alice," Richard ordered, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. "Obediently, hand over the management of your petty little technology project to our trust, and you will finally earn the distinct privilege of calling me your father." I looked down at the document, letting my hands tremble just enough to look genuinely terrified. I looked up at Julian, forcing my eyes to widen with fake, innocent confusion. "I do not understand," I whispered, my voice intentionally shaking as a perfectly timed tear rolled down my cheek. "I thought this was just a sacred family tradition to welcome me into your home. Why does the document mention the exclusive transfer of my spatial simulation algorithm? Why do you need my software?" Julian. My feigned ignorance was the perfect, irresistible bait. Men like Richard and Julian Vance possessed egos so massive, yet so incredibly fragile, that they physically could not resist the urge to brag about their own perceived brilliance to someone they considered inferior. Richard let out a loud, booming laugh, clearly amused by my apparent stupidity. "You really are a naive little girl," Richard sneered, taking a slow sip of his scotch. "Did you honestly believe a man of my stature would allow his heir to marry a nobody without securing a proper return on investment? We do not care about your little graphics project. We care about the underlying patent. It is a highly lucrative digital asset, and it belongs in the hands of men who actually know how to monetize it." "But my company," I stammered, stepping back and clutching my chest, making sure my pearl brooch was perfectly angled toward them. "Vortex Renderings was going to launch my project. Why did they suddenly cut my funding by 60%? Julian stepped forward, completely unable to hide his triumphant smirk. He wanted the credit. He wanted me to know exactly how powerful and cunning he was. "Because I personally told them to, Alice," Julian boasted, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. "I orchestrated the entire board vote. I had them choke your research and development budget to absolute zero. I needed you desperate. I needed you to realize that your little career is nothing but a fragile house of cards that I can blow down whenever I please. We are already positioning a shell company to execute a hostile takeover of Vortex Renderings next month for pennies on the dollar. We strangled your project. We monitored your phone with a hidden tracker to watch your every move, and we isolated you from your friends, all to ensure you had absolutely no choice but to sign that paper tonight." He smiled, a dark, predatory grin that made my skin crawl. And you did exactly what I calculated you would do. You came crawling back, begging for my protection. So you manipulated me? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, acting as if my heart was breaking all over again. You sabotaged my entire livelihood and spied on me just to steal my algorithm. It is not stealing, my dear, Richard interjected smoothly, leaning heavily over the oak desk, his eyes locked onto mine. It is corporate acquisition. It is the natural order of the world. The strong take from the weak. You sign that legally binding document right now, and we take everything you built. If you refuse, I will personally ensure you are permanently blacklisted from every single technology firm in the United States. Now, pick up the pen and sign. They stood there, radiating pure, intoxicating arrogance. They had just proudly confessed to corporate sabotage, market manipulation, extreme psychological abuse, illegal surveillance, and targeted financial extortion. Every single vile, law-breaking word they had just spoken echoed clearly through the silent study, and every single syllable was perfectly captured, encoded, and uploaded to a secure cloud server by the tiny military-grade microphone hidden inside the pearl brooch resting over my rapidly beating heart. They thought they had finally trapped a helpless little bird in their golden cage. They had absolutely no idea the cage was already rigged with explosives. I picked up the heavy gold pen. I let the cold, expensive metal rest between my fingers for a long, agonizing moment. Richard smirked, leaning back in his luxurious leather chair, waiting to savor his ultimate victory. Julian stood beside him, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride, fully believing he had finally broken me into absolute submission. But I did not sign the paper. Instead, I calmly set the pen down on the polished oak desk. I reached into my evening gown, pulled out my smartphone, and tapped a single, highly anticipated button on my screen. Instantly, the high-fidelity smart speakers built into the ceiling of the study, and perfectly synchronized throughout the entire Aspen mansion, crackled to life. My own voice echoed first, sounding artificially frightened and weak. So you manipulated me. You sabotaged my entire livelihood and spied on me just to steal my algorithm. Then, Julian's arrogant boast boomed through the grand corridors, completely unedited. Because I personally told them to. Alice, I orchestrated the entire board vote. Finally, Richard's cold, calculated sneer filled the room with deafening clarity. The strong take from the weak. The color violently drained from both of their faces in perfect unison. Richard's smug, triumphant expression instantly melted into a portrait of pure, unadulterated horror. Julian took a stumbling step backward, his mouth opening and closing in silent shock like a suffocating fish pulled from the water. I smiled. It was not the submissive, broken smile they had seen for the past 4 days. It was a cold, razor-sharp, and utterly victorious smile. I slowly took the massive, ridiculous diamond ring off my finger, weighed it in my hand for a split second, and tossed it directly into Richard's crystal glass of vintage scotch. It landed with a heavy splash, sending amber liquid staining across the pristine white pages of the legal document resting on the desk. "This contract is nothing but a stack of useless paper," I said, my voice completely steady and commanding, stripping away every ounce of the naive girl I had pretended to be. "You cannot steal what no longer belongs to me. 2 days ago, I officially registered the sole copyright to my spatial simulation algorithm, and yesterday morning, I sold the exclusive, irrevocable licensing rights to your single biggest corporate competitor for exactly $50 million. Julian's face contorted into a terrifying mask of absolute feral rage. "You lying bitch!" he screamed at the top of his lungs. Completely losing his mind, he violently lunged across the room, his hands reaching out to grab my throat. But before his fingers could even brush my skin, the heavy oak doors of the study burst wide open. 2 massive, heavily armed private security contractors stepped directly into his path. I had hired them using the very first cash installment of my licensing payout. instructing them to wait completely out of sight near the estate's perimeter until I gave the remote digital signal. One of the guards effortlessly grabbed Julian by his expensive tailored collar and slammed him hard against the wooden bookshelf, knocking the wind completely out of his lungs. I looked down at Richard, who was now clutching the edge of his mahogany desk, his breathing incredibly heavy and erratic. "By the way," I added casually, tilting my head, "that audio file playing right now, it was securely uploaded to an encrypted remote cloud server the very second you spoke. My intellectual property lawyer has already forwarded the unedited recording, along with a massive, undeniable digital file of your illegal insider trading records, directly to the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal agents are probably drafting your arrest warrants right at this exact moment." I turned my back on the two men who thought they could own me. I walked out of the suffocating study, marched down the grand, echoing hallway, and stepped out the heavy front doors of the mansion. The freezing Colorado blizzard whipped violently against my face, but I had never felt warmer in my entire life. I climbed into the back of the armored sports utility vehicle my security team had brought. As the driver pulled away down the snowy mountain road, I could faintly hear Julian screaming in pure, helpless humiliation, while through the glowing window, I saw Richard collapse deeply into his chair, desperately clutching his chest as his entire billion-dollar empire crumbled to dust. 6 months later, the world looked entirely different. Julian Vance stood humiliated in a federal courtroom, facing decades in federal prison for massive financial fraud, illegal wiretapping, and corporate extortion. The once mighty Vance family conglomerate filed for complete and total bankruptcy, their physical assets and portfolios entirely seized by the government. As for me, I was standing under the blinding of flashing stage lights of the largest technology convention in Silicon Valley. I was holding the most prestigious innovation award of the year, wearing a stunning red dress, absolutely single, fiercely proud, and unapologetically radiant. I built my own empire, and I did not need a single person's permission to do it. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Please let me know in the comments below. As you know, our channel was recently demonetized by YouTube, and we have zero budget left to keep operating. If you enjoyed today's story and want to support us, please consider helping out with just $1. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen, or by using the PayPal link located in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Your generosity helps pay our hardworking team so they have the money to feed their families and continue creating better, more exciting stories to serve you. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next video.